Hello, YouTube. I have been repeatedly asked to provide more details about mysteries of the Arctic, to talk more about the paranormal phenomena of the lands and islands there, about strange discoveries in its waters, about UFOs and USOs. You can see my previous videos about the Russian Arctic's paranormal. I'll put a link to the playlist. It's in the description to this video. Today, I'll tell you about 3 more phenomena in the Arctic, which are somewhat paranormal. You decide. I think you'll be fascinated and probably try to learn more. Just be very careful if you actually decide to travel to the remote places there. I do not believe that at this time the Russian Arctic is fully accessible to foreigners. Other nations with stakes there in the Arctic, I do not know. But then again, the Russian territory is unique. And Russia's adversaries are well aware of that. Let me start with those who were punished by the North Star. The Stroganovs were a family of highly successful Russian merchants, industrialists, landowners, and statesmen. From the time of Ivan the Terrible, the Russian Tsar, they were the richest businessmen in the Tsardom, or Kingdom of Russia. They financed the Russian conquest of Siberia from 1580 onwards, and also the Prince Pozharsky's 1612 reconquest of Moscow from the Poles. Around the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, Russian merchant Stroganovs organized a fishing colony on the Novaya Zemlya archipelago. Novaya Zemlya is an archipelago in northern Russia. It is situated in the Arctic Ocean in the extreme northeast of Europe, with Cape Flesinski on the northern island considered to be the easternmost point of Europe. To Novaya Zemlya's west lies the Barents Sea, and to the east, the Kara Sea. The settlers extracted walruses, seals, whales, polar bears, Arctic foxes, deer in that area, and also they boiled the fat of marine animals. According to northern legends, some colonists were secretly instructed to search for pearls in the rivers of Novaya Zemlya. Perhaps the Stroganovs were dreaming of getting the legendary green incorruptible pearl. There are no documents and evidence of the search for and the existence of pearls in the northern archipelago, but there are records of the Stroganovs' stay on the Novaya Zemlya. In 1762, a book was published, written by an official of the Arkhangelsk governor, a certain Klingstedt. And here's what it says. The old tradition knows that several families fled and settled with their wives and children on Novaya Zemlya during the devastation of Novgorod during the reign of Ivan Vasilievich, Klingstedt wrote. The runaway peasants belonging to the Stroganov family died with their wives and children, and the Russians still know the villages where these people lived and indicate their names, but the descendants of the unfortunate families all died at the same time, apparently from an infection caused by fogs. The mysterious, deadly fog is also mentioned in northern legends. People who live in the Arctic thousands of years ago, whose souls were not accepted by the polar star for all sorts of sins, turned into fog. This fog then shrinks, spreads over vast spaces, extinguishes all sounds, does not allow you to see anything, drives people crazy, kills on the spot, or forever shrouds. Those punished by the polar star can be forgiven only when they find for it the unfading green incorruptible pearl. Therefore, the deadly fog does not allow newcomers from the mainland to find pearls in the rivers of Novaya Zemlya. Centuries passed. During the World War II, Nazi jackals paid close attention to the Soviet Arctic. Maybe they even knew about that fog. In 1943, Novaya Zemlya briefly served as a secret seaplane base for Nazi Germany's Kriegsmarine to provide German surveillance of Allied shipping en route to Siberia. The seaplane base was established by U-255 and U-711, which were operating along the northern coast of Soviet Russia as part of the 13th U-boat flotilla. Seaplane sorties were flown in August and September of 1943. Did the Nazi lurid paranormal research organization look for the fog? I do not know. They did operate and search for the artifacts in the Kola Peninsula. And I have more videos about Nazis in the Soviet Arctic and what they left behind. But in July of 1954, Novaya Zemlya was designated as the Soviet nuclear weapons testing venue, construction of which began in October and existed, this testing venue, existed much of the Cold War. Of course, it was classified and completely off limits for the foreigners. I don't know if any of the Western spies were managed to break through. It's quite possible. Whether the Soviets knew about the fog, I do not know, and I do not know what foreign intelligence service people could have found out if they ever got to Novaya Zemlya. So the strange fog that drives people crazy and maims them. Now, let's look at the other mysterious phenomenon. I talked about it some in my other videos, but I want to add more here. The call of the polar star. What strange phenomenon is driving inhabitants of the far north crazy? The call of the polar star is a beautiful name for a frightening phenomenon that causes residents of the far north and eastern Siberia areas to fall into hysteria for no reason. Let's look at the manifestations. Well, the ethnospecific mental disorder appears in various literature, not only as the call of the polar star, also known as the pole star or the North Star, but also as Meriachenie and Menerik, which in the Yakut language means to do strange things. Now, Meriachenie is the Russian term, and I'll get more into that. For the first time, this unusual phenomenon was mentioned at the end of the 19th century by the ethnographer and expert on Siberia Václav Seroshevsky, who called it Menerik. In his work Yakuts, he noted that married women with female diseases are more susceptible to this disorder, which causes both mental and physical suffering to a person, although men are also at risk. Describing the nature of the manifestation of seizures, the scientist stated their frequency. Suddenly, Menerik that strikes a person makes him or her howl, pronounce meaningless texts, rush from corner to corner, and hysteria until he or she loses his or her strength and falls asleep. The Soviet former revolutionary and then medical professional Sergei Mickiewicz, who, when he was a doctor in Srednye-Kolymsk, studied special local diseases, he made his contribution to the study of the call of the polar star. The result of his activity was the monograph Menerik and Emirachania, published in 1929, forms of hysteria in the Kolyma region, in which he called this unusual disease polar hysteria. Its symptoms included throat cramps, sinking of the heart, urge to vomit, hallucinations, convulsions, pain in different parts of the body, as well as mysterious chants and the adoption of strange poses. In turn, Sidorov and Davidov divided Menerik and Emirachnia by gender, considering that men are subject to the first and women with increased anxiety to the second. In the monograph Myriachnia and Convulsive Twitching Disease, Ardaleon Tokarsky noted that he had seen people exposed to this nervous pathology in Transbaikal area and in the Burat city of Kyakhta. According to him, a person suddenly falling into this psychopathic state begins to repeat the actions and phrases of those around him with unbridled impulsiveness. In addition, the sick person was happy to fulfill a variety of something dangerous, of absurd orders, and after coming out of the trance, he did not remember anything at all. All the specialists who dealt with the problem of the call of the polar star stated that often this disease had the character of an epidemic when several dozen residents of a closed environment fell into a trance at the same time. In addition, Myriachnia was often recorded among the visitors to the Arctic who, for some inexplicable reasons, were filled with unimaginable energy, lost touch with the outside world, and fell into ecstasy. Western researchers have written about a similar disorder observed in Eskimos. They called it Piblokto, or Arctic hysteria, and associated its appearance with extremely low temperatures, lack of sun, and an overabundance of vitamin A in the body of Arctic residents. So, scientists have not yet come to a consensus on the nature of the phenomenon of Myriachnia, against which even modern medicine is powerless. Adherents of esoteric beliefs tend to believe that a person affected by Myriachnia falls under the influence of some higher force that makes him or her, contrary to common sense, rush north to the polar star. It is noteworthy that the most weakened and sick members of the community feel the greatest surge of strength, and it can be very difficult to keep them from performing actions that are disastrous for them. In their vision, they rely on an ancient legend in which it is narrated that the soul of every diseased northerner goes to the heavenly palace, standing directly under the polar star. It is not given to the living to see this otherworldly castle, but when the souls of the dead open its windows, an incredibly beautiful light known as the Northern Lights is shed on the earth. With the help of these lights, the gods lure and summon the souls of living people, and those who manage to catch this call, they fall into a trance and begin their journey to the polar star. Of course, one can relate to this legend in different ways, but in archival documents, there is a note from 1792 in which the unenviable fate of the merchant Ribin's son is narrated. A young man with his father went to sea on a fishing schooner, fell ill with scurvy, and lay exhausted in bed. What was the surprise of the crew when, after the appearance of the aurora borealis in the sky, Alexei, barely moving, energetically got out on the deck and, without noticing anyone, rushed overboard and sailed north, so to say. And that was it. He was gone. By the way, polar explorers who heard rumors about the oddities that happened to people during the polar night included straitjackets in the equipment of the expedition to try to cope with those who would respond to the call of the polar star. In the early 1920s, academician Bekhterev, and you can see my other videos about his very interesting psi research and his very sad fate. Anyway, he became interested in the mysterious phenomenon, especially after he received a message from a former exile Grigoriev, a doctor by profession, who lived in Lilovo Ozero area on the Kola Peninsula before the Russian Revolution. Grigoriev told about his observations of the spontaneous occurrence of measles among the local population, found out that these outbreaks occur simultaneously in neighboring settlements, and unequivocally linked this with the appearance of the aurora borealis. That is, he claimed that myriachenia is apparently the result of some external influence of nature. At that time, Bekhterev headed the Brain Institute he had created in Petrograd, as the Soviets called St. Petersburg. And on January 30, 1920, at a meeting of the Institute's scientific conference, his employee, Professor Barchenko, was sent to Lapland with an expedition to collect factual materials and understand the nature of this strange psychic phenomenon. And although Professor Barchenko himself was interested in completely different problems in this expedition, or issues, or questions, in particular the search for traces of the legendary Hyperborea, he fulfilled the boss's instructions with due diligence, spent almost 2 years in this area, and reported on the results at the Brain Institute. His report was highly appreciated by Bekhterev, although the physical nature of this phenomenon has not been clarified. The expedition led by Barchenko found that the shamans of some northern ethnicities can cause a similar condition in a person consciously. But how they do it, scientists could not find out. For 2 years, he had lived among the Laplands, and tried to find an explanation for the mysterious phenomenon of myriachenia, which he called mental contagion, observing how the locals spontaneously, but at the same time how they entered into a trance, repeating each other's actions, predicting the future, inflicting cruel wounds on themselves, and then, as if nothing had happened, return to their previous state. The researcher vainly asked the shamans to discover the nature of this phenomenon. So, it took him 2 years, and he lived among the Saami people, or they called them Laplanders at that time. But only thanks to the help of one church official, local one, Barchenko, it was possible for him to find the half-buried trenches, amazing menhirs, giant rock cult images, a huge yellow enchanted stone, and ruins of prehistoric cult centers on one of the islands. And you can see it in my other videos about Barchenko and then the Soviet precursor of the KGB expeditions, also, and how he was involved with them. This discovery allowed him to assume that the Lapps are descendants of the most ancient Tibetan civilization, whose representatives possessed primordial paranormal knowledge and therefore can so easily come into contact with the otherworldly forces. Some scientists tend to believe that the inhabitants of the North are beginning to hear the call of the polar star Thanks to the efforts of shamans, striking their tambourines and pronouncing spells, they put their relatives in a hypnotic state, forcing them to feel animal terror, perform strange commands, actively gesticulate, run at fantastic speed, and mutter incomprehensible words. The Northerners themselves believe that their mental disorder is associated with the leprosy of spirits. In one case, a person becomes a hostage of demons who force him to do obscene things, and in the other, a good spirit inhabits him, guiding the good actions of the mortal. Let me tell you now about some actual observations in the most recent times. Yuri Refremov, Deputy Chairman of the Krasnodar Regional Branch of the Russian Geographical Society, Professor, Doctor of Geographical Scientist, Honored Scientist of the Kubani, Honored Traveler of the Russian Federation, an honorary member of the Russian Geographical Society, and honorary meteorologist of the Russian Federation. So he wintered at the Молодежная station in the 29th Soviet Antarctic expedition, and he conducted scientific experiments on the construction of the artificial eye birth. So this is a no-nonsense person. In the late 1960s, Yefremov visited one of the Soviet North weather stations in the Barents Sea. It was during the polar night. Graduates of the Leningrad Meteorological Institute worked at the station, and traditionally, instructors, which he was one, were dispatched there to inspect their work. So Yefremov, still a young engineer at the time, volunteered. The team at the meteorological station were full of goodwill towards the inspector, and a small banquet ensued. Yefremov was somewhat perplexed by the presence there of one named Yasha, who graduated from the Odessa Hydrometeorological Institute. Its graduates worked in the southern regions of the USSR and never ventured far north, like Yasha did. There were even medical instructions on this account. The farther south a person was born and grew up, the more difficult it is for him to live and work beyond the Arctic Circle. But Yasha was not just a crack who decided to endure difficulties for the sake of adventure. He had more ambitious plans. See, he wanted to visit Antarctica in the future. Well, to do this, Yasha acquired two more very necessary professions there, a cook and a radio operator. Yefremov thought that the calculation was correct. The cook, who could even work miracles from canned food, would have been taken with open arms. During the banquet, Yasha was chosen to be the toast master. But gradually, as the bottles were being emptied with alcohol, the company split into separate groups, while Yefremov remained with the graduates and Yasha. It took Yefremov a while to notice that Yasha quickly fell silent and almost did not support the conversation. He withdrew. Even earlier, out of the corner of Yefremov's ear, so to say, he heard a remark from Yasha's friend that the station chief Kuzmich asked him not to abuse alcohol. But this time, the Odessa resident broke down, and it seems like he abused alcohol. It seems that no one but Yefremov paid attention to how Yasha got up and staggered out into the corridor of this wooden house. Almost immediately, the front door slammed, behind which the tundra and the ice hummocks of the Barents Sea began. When the Odessa resident did not return a few minutes later, Yefremov turned to one of the interlocutors and said, "Will Yasha freeze? There, it looks like he was walking without even getting dressed." The guy reacted quickly and, wearing a warm fly jacket and a fluffy fur coat, also went outside. A minute later, he burst into the room shouting, Bros, alert! Yashka is leaving. The mess immediately emptied, the mess hole, and only Yefremov held on for a while, remembering Kuzmich's direct order: never venture outside alone. They will eat you. He did not specify who would eat, but Yefremov had read enough northern stories to accept the order for unconditional fulfillment, so to say. Therefore, after careful addressing, checking the flashlight, and the only weapon he had, a penknife, the young engineer left the station last. The first thing he saw was a grand aurora borealis that filled the entire northern part of the sky, and a distant human figure was already walking towards it across the flat, boundless ice field. People were running behind it in a sprawling chain. The first of those who caught up with the departing one, for some reason, continued to walk in the same direction for some time. And then, as it seemed to Yefremov, he pushed Yasha into the snow, and both disappeared from sight. Everything ended well. Yasha was brought back and put to bed, where a doctor, who was, by the way, was also a cook at the same time, took care of him. In the evening, the head of the station returned from the district office, where he was looking for parts for the diesel power plant at their station. After learning about the story with the Odessa resident, he cursed and uttered a monologue that was not transpirated on paper due to the language that was used, in which Yefremov, as a guest, got the least of the cussing. Moreover, he was the first to raise the alarm, after all. He should not have come here, Kuzmich explained later, but Yasha asked for it himself to be sent to the Arctic station. The guy seems to be healthy, so he would do. Kuzmich warned him that if he sees Pazori outside of the window, not to take a drop of alcohol in his mouth. There is such a disease. Pomors call it miryachka, apparently from the word mereshitsa, which means to seem in Russian, according to Yefremov. The other northern ethnicities have a more beautiful name for it: the call of the polar star. Mostly weakened people get sick. Previously, those with scurvy especially succumb to it. And for some southerners, like Yasha, it occurs simply after much drinking of alcohol. Apparently, this disease is associated with the aurora borealis, but no one really knows anything about it. A person, as it were, disconnects from the outside world if he is able to move, for some reason goes straight to the north, to the polar star, hence the name. Yes, you saw it yourself, added Kuzmich, but the worst thing is for those afflicted with heart conditions. After some severe outbursts, a heart attack is guaranteed, often with a fatal outcome. For Kuzmich too, as the radiance begins, his heart aches. So it's time to finish with the north until the polar one calls, he said. The next day, Yasha felt quite normal. He didn't even have time to catch a cold. Here the dose taken of the alcohol had a positive effect. But he looked silent and depressed. To Yefremov's shame, even though he was a beginning graduate student, he could not say anything sensible about this phenomenon. But after returning to Leningrad, he firmly decided to figure it out. In the essays devoted to the history of the development of the Spitsbergen by Russian sailors, one such case is mentioned. In 1792, a strange emergency occurred on the merchant Rybin's industrial schooner. The merchant's son Alexei, who had scurvy during the voyage and was lying in the cabin, after the appearance of the bright pulsating northern lights, got out on the deck, threw himself overboard, and sailed north. It was not possible to save him. So we have the same story as from the other sources. But here's something else. In 1870, an officer of the Nizhny Kolyma Kazakh detachment was horrified to inform the local doctor. Up to 70 people are sick with some strange disease in the lower Kolyma part. This is their disastrous suffering. It happens more at night. Some start with the singing of in different languages, incomprehensible. I recall seeing the 5 Chertkov brothers and their sister every day from 9 p.m. to midnight and beyond. If one sang, then all sing in different Yukagir, Lamaut, and Yakut languages, so that one does not know the other. For their pets have a lot of supervision over them. That's how it was written. Each individual case can be interpreted differently, but in the journal The World of the Unknown, published in 1991 by the Siberian Research Center, there is a description of a collective case of this kind, which occurred on August 8, 1985, in the village of Kozhevnikov, in the Tomsk region. Here it is necessary to give one explanation. If the energy of charged particles ejected from the depths of the sun exceeds the level of several BeV, billion electron volts, then they will no longer be deflected to the poles by the Earth's magnetic field and can reach much more southern regions and will penetrate much deeper into the atmosphere up to the surface layers. In such cases, a local aurora borealis may occur, similar in its physical factors to the traditional one. Here's the account from that 1980s case. The weather was clear and warm in the morning. We settled down on the bank of the Ob River, put up a tent. After lunch, A and B went on the itinerary. At the request of eyewitnesses, their names are not indicated. The weather began to deteriorate gradually. The sky was covered with clouds. A fine rain began to fall. By 9 o'clock, the wind began to increase. An hour later, the guys returned. We hid in the tent, but around 11 o'clock, we had to move to an abandoned trailer. It's a terrible thunderstorm. It's the first time I've seen such lightning flashes. It seemed that the firmament was divided into several parts. The storm continued with the onset of the night. Suddenly, it was at 0 hours 20 minutes. We noticed a strange glow. It began to get lighter. In a couple of minutes, you could read the newspaper. The light source was behind the forest. It gradually increased in size, then stopped growing, and the glow began to pulsate. It was a grand sight. I've never seen anything like it in my life. In some ways, it resembled the powerful northern lights, only it was brighter, but it did not hurt the eyes. The color was constantly changing, pink, red, bluish, yellow. It constantly pulsed, resembling the Morse code. We all have a very strong and strange feeling which is expressed. It seems to me that it's calling me a little more and I'll go there. All this resembled mass hypnosis, but without fear, although we saw something incomprehensible and tremendous. There were some high and bright thoughts in my head. The mood lifted, the pulse became somewhat faster. We did not pay attention to the thunderstorm and rain, although it all continued with renewed vigor. We forgot that we were wet and cold. They just stared at the spectacle, literally opening their mouths. At 0 hours 30 minutes, suddenly everything went out and turned into terrible darkness. We continued to stand and stare into the darkness, and not without a reason. 2 minutes later, a new flash in the same place. It was light again. The next day, we found out that this phenomenon was happening over an electrical substation. That night, all the fuses were knocked out at the substation, and there was no light in the village for half a day. This is the first time something like this has happened there. The station is equipped with good lightning rods, so this is not related to lightning discharge. The watchman could not add anything significant. When this phenomenon began, he got scared and ran away. The author of the message correctly connected the failure of the substation with the observed phenomenon. It is known that powerful solar flares generating aurora borealis create intense pulsating currents in the earth, disabling both communication lines and electric power lines and transformers. Such phenomena were especially frequent in the polar regions in 1982 and 1984. Only now, wrote Yefremov, we will have to end the story on an alarming note. Studies have shown that with the help of powerful short-wave transmitters, as well as ionospheric radars located in polar regions, it is possible to create not only artificial aurora borealis, northern lights, but by modulating the signal in a certain way to cause low-frequency bioactive electromagnetic fields on the Earth's surface, protecting psychotronic effects on a person. Additionally, it would be in a predetermined area. These studies, added Yefremov, were immediately classified and remain so to this day. In 1982, by the way, in my research of Soviet ufology, they had a tremendous amount of cases, and I've tried to collect as many as possible, and quite interesting ones in the north. It's like something attracted UFOs and USOs to the area. Anyway, what about Western observations? Since the beginning of the 20th century, the English Dr. Watson, participating in a number of polar expeditions, encountered a strange mental illness that could suddenly occur in several people at once. At the same time, people seemed to disconnect from the surrounding world. They began to make rhythmic movements and sometimes moved strictly in the direction of the north. When trying to keep them, they began to run amok. Watson called this disease polar or expedition rabies. For the sake of fairness, it should be noted that this disease has long been known to the inhabitants of the north. Among the Russian Pomors, it was called Myrячение, and among the Eskimos, the call of the polar star. However, even before Watson, the famous polar explorer Amundsen encountered this disease, I guess when he was off the coast of Antarctica at the end of the 19th century as a navigator for the Belgica vessel. In 1898, this vessel stayed for the winter of Antarctica. It was then that he had to deal with the cases of severe mental disorders of several members of the expedition. One of them, a young Norwegian, Tollefsen, heard the call of the polar star, jumped overboard and ran away into the snowy desert. Another sailor, when trying to calm him down, almost killed Amundsen himself with an axe. When preparing for his first expedition, the famous polar explorer Baird visited Amundsen for advice. He told him about his own observations of cases of polar rabies. The consultation with the polar master had such a strong effect on Baird that he made an unprecedented decision, 12 straitjackets were included in the inventory of the expedition property. Fortunately, this time the straitjackets were not needed, but during this and subsequent polar expeditions, doctors discovered a curious pattern. Many cases of mental illness coincided with the pulsating auroras, mostly red. The number of such diseases increased sharply during the years of maximal solar activity, when the brightest aurora borealis occur. The Indians living in the north of Canada and the Eskimos of Alaska have a beautiful legend. The souls of the dead fly to the heavenly palace, above which the polar star is burning. For living people, this palace is invisible. Sometimes its inhabitants open the windows, the light from them falls on the clouds, and people read it. These are the auroras, but when the upper gods open the windows in their palaces, it means that they call to themselves the souls of still living people, and the person who hears this call goes to meet him on his last journey to the polar star. So it's very similar to what the northern people and ethnicities that live in the Russian Federation and previously Russian Empire, they have similar legends. When did the development of the polar regions began in the last 2 centuries, explorers and polar navigators became convinced with mystical horror of the reality of the Indian legend. Quite often, there were cases when one of the members of the expedition suddenly fell under the influence of some force and rushed across the ice strictly to the north, to the polar star. This happened especially often with the sick and weakened people, but when others tried to delay them on their disastrous path, they fell into madness and broke out with superhuman strength. I have another interesting observation from Russia, and I have to present them all those that make sense, I think, or more serious ones. Well, listen to this one. Myriachenia is an interesting phenomenon that has always been associated with shamans and northern magic. It is kind of psychopathological state in which a person, regardless of his own desire, copies the actions and words of others, or obeys any orders from outside, coming from another person, or, as some northern people believe, from the spirits of the polar star. The name of this mysterious disease comes from the Yakut menerik, to do strange things. Not only the local population is exposed to measles, but even more so are visitors, and they also mean menerik. The indigenous inhabitants of the north have long been accustomed to the emergence of such a state among the members of their tribes, and they record flashes of this disease, menerik, just during the northern lights, which, according to scientists, is the key factor in this mental disorder. Eskimos and several other ethnicities, periodically hearing this call of the polar star, go outside and arrange crazy dances, moving to the beat of melody that only they can hear. Myriachenia can be of a group nature, expressed in the violence of several people, and the number of them can be equal to dozens or even hundreds. Sometimes they form a kind of round dance and walk in circles non-stop until exhaustion. The researchers observed how a strange state covered almost the entire population of villages. People synchronously began to repeat each other's movements, both inside the houses and outside. As if on command, they sang in different languages, even in those they do not know. More terrible cases have been reported when almost the entire population of an Eskimo or an Indian settlement suddenly abandoned their homes, small children even burning hearths, and left, as if at someone's call, into the white silence. An attack of Arctic hysteria begins with the fact that a person completely disconnects from the outside world, that is, enters a trance. The patient makes rhythmic movements, makes incomprehensible incomprehensible sounds, but most often as if falling under the influence of some force that points him in the direction. He rushes through the ice exactly to the north, to the polar star. Sick and weakened people are especially susceptible to this maneric. Women are much more prone to myriachinia than men. The woman seized by the myriachinia ceases to feel pain and becomes a clairvoyant for a while. She can somehow mentally visit the past and the future and then quite accurately predict the fate of any person. All attempts to bring the zombie to life lead to nothing. A person continues to be in his other world until a certain time. When others try to detain him on this disastrous path, he shows superhuman strength of resistance and goes on a rampage. For Arctic hysteria, a number of cases have been described when several adult men could not forcibly hold one person, even a teenager, who entered the state of myriachka, or conversely, when exhausted by illness or old age, got up and gained the strength of a young man. Now, let's try to summarize and explain. It is obvious that the phenomenon of Arctic hysteria is associated with climatic conditions, more precisely with the polar night. The dark night lasts all winter. Time freezes and only occasionally the northern lights illuminate the black sky. The polar night, which seems endless, severe frost and deep snows create conditions for self-isolation, so that a person stays at home for weeks and months and does not communicate with anyone. That is, the harsh northern nature itself creates conditions for a person identical to the conditions in which a hermit monk resides. Well, then everything happens exactly as with the monks. The devil prefers to tempt monks to a greater extent than laymen, and among monks, he often attacks the most zealous, usually remaining indifferent to lukewarm and careless monks. Thus, myriachinia or Arctic hysteria is the equivalent of the demonic insurance. For an encounter, contact with spirits, sensory deprivation is necessary, which is created by the long polar night. The north is one continuous monastery, or if you like it, a hut on chicken legs, referring to a magic dwelling of a powerful witch from the Russian fairy tales, where people approach the border between two worlds on long polar nights. They listen to the sounds and trends from the other world, tune into a different wave, so to say, and fall into a kind of trance. At the same time, apparently spontaneous initiations may occur in some cases, as a result of which new shamans are born, but most often the myriachinia is limited to mild forms of shamanic disease. After suffering from Arctic hysteria, people who were subjected to myriachinia return to normal life. Myriachinia, of course, is a disease of initiation. This is a state characterized by imitation of the words, gestures, and actions of others and uncontrollable desire to fulfill their orders. The Russian psychiatrist Pavel Yakovlevich Rosenbach wrote that another feature of myriachinia is that patients with uncontrollable impulsiveness repeat the words and actions of others and execute the orders given to them, even the most ridiculous and dangerous ones. Now, let me now tell you the last phenomenon for this video, as I promised you. In the north, it is believed that in ancient times, sorcerers grew some kind of essence on the remains of food or drinks, outwardly similar to mold. It was placed in the traditional Russian drinks, kvass, mors, or beer, and given to the victim to drink, thus planting a hiccup into that person. And such cases are not excluded nowadays. A sign of the disease is the constant, indomitable hiccup. Once in a person, the entity, that essence, could take on a different appearance, a devil, a frog, an insect, or even another person who settled in the sick person's stomach. Somehow it reminds me of one very popular science fiction movie made in 1979. So, and that entity is happy to inform the victim of his name, usually human name, Yegorka, Pavle, Dasha, and others, and continue to describe his appearance through the mouth of the one he or it inhabited, and lived in it for years. There are three kinds of this strange mental illness. With the mute variety, the patients not only hiccup, but also yawn, tears flow, and limbs tremble. The roaring hiccup is accompanied by a spasm of the larynx, and the person's voice changes beyond recognition. When talking, prolonged hiccups are accompanied by shouting words and phrases. So this was the third variety. And the carriers could find missing things and predict the future. Hiccups are known to Karelians, Mordvins, Vyatich, Permians, and other northern ethnicities. This entity could silently guide its bearer for years, forcing him to perform actions peculiar to him and keep his whole life under control. The entity emitted its voice when people, were going to expel it. By the way, the demon knew when his victim was due to die, and he himself decided whether to leave that person or move into his relative or acquaintance. Some Russians believed that if a deceased person suffering from hiccups crossed himself, the demon ceased to exist. In 1785, Bishop Veniamin of Arkhangelsk and Holmogorsk wrote to the Synod church authorities that this was a special kind of corruption and possession by an evil spirit. He associated this disease with the pagan beliefs of the local population, inherited by them from the ancient people of the white-eyed Chud, who lived in these parts and who possessed paranormal abilities. This belief that the hiccups were caused by sorcerers led to a popular riot or uprising in 1862, and the crowd burned their houses. The people were pacified only with the help of the Russian imperial troops and the clergy. This phenomenon most often took place in the villages of the Arkhangelsk region, and pregnant women were most susceptible to it. The disease, which appeared in one of the residents, would engulf the whole village in a few days. The symptoms could disappear within a trace in a few weeks, but return in a year or two. As for the white-eyed Chud, please see my videos about this mysterious tribe or people that vanished from the surface of the planet and where they may be residing now. This is what I wanted to let you know today. And please subscribe to my channel. Please help my research if you can. You will find the links on how to do it in the description to this video. Please tell others. And thank you for your attention to my work.